Yeah. I call to order the Thursday, September 19th, 2024 meeting of the New Bern Planning and Zoning Board. Will you all please stand and repeat the Pledge of Allegiance for us to our flag of our country. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, you may be seated. Thank you. Kendrick, can we get a roll call, please?
Yes, sir. The first member is going to be Mr. Kyle Deering. And just let the record show Mr. Deering is absent. Second member, Board Member Danielle Peoples.
Present.
Board Member Kip Paragoy. Let the record show he is also absent. Chairman Brad Jefferson.
Here.
Board Member Rusty Ingram.
Here.
Board Member Kelly Kaiser.
Here.
Board Member Thomas Brownell.
Here.
And Board Member Marshall Ballard.
Here.
And we do have a quorum.
All right, thank you, Kendrick. I'll entertain a motion on the agenda.
I move we approve tonight's agenda.
I'll second that.
Motion and second. Any discussion on that? No? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Agenda passes. All right, so we'll move into chairman's remarks. I'll do my best to keep this brief. I do want to talk about a couple things at the steering committee for the land use ordinance. I want to draw the board's attention and the public's, for that matter, to the September 10th workshop meeting for the Board of Aldermen. It's on YouTube. It's about 2 hours long, but it's basically what I sat through in the steering committee. And it's well worth a watch, particularly about 19 and a half minutes in. Our consultant Chad brings up conditional zoning, which I think is going to have a big impact on this board. Not that the land use ordinance won't, but that particularly is a big change for us. And basically, and there's a lot of details that need to be ironed out, but basically there's two versions of conditional zoning. That rezoning, there would be an unlimited and a limited versions, and it would replace the planned unit development plan, the PUDs, giving this board and the Board of Aldermen more room to negotiate and talk back and forth. What those limits are and other details I'm still unclear on. We'll work those out as we go. Most of the rest of the state does this. This is not a unique thing for the city of New Bern. Most everyone does this. But one other interesting point that I thought was, and again, the details need to be worked out, is there's supposed to be a, quote, neighborhood plan, a neighborhood meeting, excuse me, that the developer would put on beforehand, before coming to us. I'm not sure how you define neighborhood meeting or who has to come or anything like that. But I think it would be important that someone from this board, be it myself or someone else, and we can figure out who goes to those meetings and at least takes notes. And so, because when it comes before us, I think it would be good to have those notes from the citizens on the object that's coming up. And we know our fellow citizens of New Bern, some of their requests are going to be a bit outlandish, though well-intentioned. So some things may not be brought up, but other things should be, and I think we should help that process. And then when it goes to the Board of Aldermen for them to finally approve it, it gives it a little more teeth. And then maybe that stuff's already ironed out to where they don't have to deal with it. So I think that would be good. And it's that 2-hour meeting is well worth it. What's coming up, they're in phase 4 of their plan. They're in the initial draft and text phase on the map. That's what's coming next. So here pretty soon, we're going to start getting text revisions to the steering committee. I'm not sure if that's going public. I would assume it would be going public. And then I maybe at that point, this board needs to have some discussions on this land use ordinance. We can feed that data back into the consultant if we have any comments on that. Because the land use ordinance is big. It's what this board is supposed to look after. And it's a big change. You're talking 1,000 pages or so. So that's going to be a big deal. And then one other item, perhaps in new business, if one of the board members would like to make a motion on a vice chair, I would entertain that motion, though I can't make it. So with that, We're going to move into the action items, but before that, last meeting, we approved the rules of procedures, and in that discussion, we thought that it would be good at the beginning of our meetings to have just a little verbiage on what this board responsibilities are in terms of what our responsibilities are. So let me read this out. And by the way, I was going to come up with this, and I had about 2 sentences. And Miss Danielle Peoples took this the other day at lunch. Me and her were talking about it, and she's wrote a lot, and I think it's really good. And so I'm going to use most of what she has here with just a couple changes. As a background context, the responsibilities of the Planning and Zoning Board this evening include approval of general and final subdivision plots and making recommendations to the Board of Aldermen considering zoning text and map amendments. The 7 members of this board were appointed by the Board of Aldermen and must reside within city limits. 1 member is appointed by the Craven County Board of Commissioners and resides within the city's ETJ, the extraterritorial jurisdiction. Thank you. Awesome. Commonly referred to as the ETJ. This board is an advisory authority to the Board of Aldermen. The Board of Aldermen acts in the legislative capacity and follows voting procedures as part of its official meetings. The Board of Aldermen is not bound to the recommendations of the Planning and Zoning Board. The 2 items this evening will have a staff report. We will then take public comment, limited to 3 minutes per speaker, and then we'll have the applicant's remarks after that. This order and public comment protocol reflects this board's recently adopted rules and procedures. So with that, we're going to move into item number 6A. And this introducing Taylor Homes on Lake Phase 2 and 3 General Plan Planned Unit Development. This item falls under the major subdivision general and final plot approvals. This board has a decision to approve the action reflecting the plan satisfies the technical requirements of the city land use ordinance, or deny the action indicating the plan fails to satisfy the technical requirements of the city's land use ordinance. If the board finds the plot or proposed subdivision fails to comply with 1 or more requirements of the city land use ordinances, the motion must state the deficiency and the basis of which the proposed subdivision could be approved. The original subdivision ordinance of the city was adopted by the Board of Aldermen on February 7th of 1956. It became effective immediately thereafter and has been subsequently amended, most recently on November 22nd, 2022. The ordinance lays out that major subdivisions are subject to a 2-step approval process. Physical improvements to the land must be subdivided or authorized by approval of the proposed subdivision by the Planning and Zoning Board and at the general plan stage. Sale of lots permitted at the final plat approval and provided in Section 1517 of the Land Use Ordinance. So with that, Kendrick, I open it up to you for your staff report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. For this first item, this is Tyler Home on the Lake. It's phases 2 and 3. It's a general plan, PUD or planned unit development. And this is major subdivision 002-932-2024. The applicant is John G. Thomas, PE owner, principal engineer for Thomas Engineering, PA. The owner, Stars and Stripes for F LLC, and the location in the general vicinity is off of Lake Tyler Drive for New Bern, North Carolina. The existing zoning is residential 10A or R-10A, and the size approximately per the plat is 20.78 total acres. The overview here, the proposed plan unit development is for 141 single-family attached units. The subject properties are currently zoned, again, as R-10A. This is established as a residential district per our city's land use ordinance. And basically the purpose for these residential districts is to provide comfortability, health, and safety. And here first we have the vicinity map, and this highlights the 4 different parcel numbers that you'll find for the properties. This pertains to the actual proposal. That's followed by the buffer map, and this is the buffer map we take. It is a 100-foot radius from the actual property lines for the subject properties. Following that, this is a aerial, just to kind of give you a snapshot of what's on the ground. This is from 2021. And the zoning map, which is going to reflect that R-10A color, is designated and shown there. And you can see the color as well as it's highlighted in red. And that's followed by the site plan here as proposed. And the staff's evaluation, the applicant has been engaged with Public Works. This is to resolve some concerns addressing the parking. That was been a continuous engagement between those parties, and realistically, we'd like to let the board, if they do have questions, you can let those folks entertain those questions. I think they'll be able to explain a lot more. And then as far as for all the other comments from the departmental review committee, those have been addressed. And if the board has any questions that I may be able to touch on, I'll take those at this time.
So, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you if you had questions.
I do. So I have a couple questions. I was reading through the DRC report. One of the things it talks about is the parking space dimensions for the amenity area. And it states in the applicant's response that it's labeled as future, but I don't see that on the revised site plan. So is it actually labeled as future on a site plan that you guys have as the official copy?
From what I can recall, I believe we had wanted them to disclose necessarily what that was going to potentially be for the future. We would probably have to see and address that with the applicant once more, and just to see what that answer may be. So I'd probably defer to the applicant to better answer that question.
Okay. Then farther down in the DRC report, there's a discussion about streets, public works, streets, and the trash issue.
Correct.
It states there that the applicant is stating they don't agree with Public Works assessment, but we don't see any subsequent conversations as to how that got resolved, if it got resolved.
Right.
And so, I'm reticent to say let's go ahead unless we know what this is really going to be.
Fully understood, and that's where the applicant in Public Works, Mr. George Strauss, he's also in attendance for this meeting to actually hopefully provide some clarity.
Okay.
I don't want to speak to that because I'm
Sure.
not 100% certain as to those exchanges as well. So I would defer to those folks.
Okay, so those are the questions I have.
Yes, sir.
Is that amenity area actually labeled as future? And is the city going to require that they say basically what that's going to be? Okay. The second question is for the streets. Has that been resolved from the DRC comments? And the trash, has that been resolved? Those are my three questions.
So with the plan on screen, the amenity area is at the end of the cul-de-sac for the larger parcel on the left. And they have addressed the trash pickup areas, although it is hard to see because it is a thin red line that notates those areas where trash cans would be placed. It is kind of hard to see at this extent, but it is a large plan, so unfortunately it's not very visible from this screen.
Well, I see the amenity area on the map, but it doesn't say that it's future. That's the question.
Yep.
It states in the applicant responded to the DRC comments and said that was labeled on the plan as future, but it's not. So is it or isn't it? If it's not future, then we're basically approving it as it stands. If it's future, we're not, because they'd have to come back and tell us, I believe. So that's why I'm asking the question. I want to know what we're actually approving. The trash, I'd like to have the applicant address, that particular issue. As far as the streets goes, and the Public Works Department not identifying those or accepting those as city streets, that's something I'd like to hear from the Public Works Department before we go forward.
Any other questions for Kendrick?
All right. And Mr. Chairman, I'm going to get you the list of folks that might want to speak to.
Okay.
I'm gonna bring that up.
Sound, does George, do you have any comments on this matter?
A little shorter than Kendrick. Yes, and we had some follow-up conversations with the developer regarding trash, and our main concern was with the density and rollout cans, how we were going to facilitate that. And then they came back with some accommodations. We had no ordinance to make them do this. This was just a recommendation due to our experience with existing subdivisions that had higher density, and, you know, it made some of our services more difficult. As to the streets, you know, our intent right now, should this pass, that we would end up accepting the streets. As the plan is shown, we do have concerns about the parking, the way, and this was a modification through multiple conversations with the developer on how we could accommodate that. From a safety concern, that's what brings it to us. And then there's ordinance that actually restricts being able to back out onto a public street. So the accommodation for the trash is good. The parking, which we would like to have in some sort due to the density, we're not going to be able to do it with spaces that would back out.
Board had questions for Public Works Director.
Can you explain just tell me what the ordinance summarize what it states in regards to backing on to a public street, please?
Yes, it said, I'll give you the ordinance here.
And perhaps I can be helpful in that regard. I think Mr. Childs is referring to section 15346B, which says vehicle accommodation areas shall be designed so that without resorting to extraordinary movements, vehicles may exit such areas without backing onto a public street. Okay. And I think Mr. Childs may be referencing, there are several satellite parking areas indicated on the plat in various different areas located adjacent to some of the streets that are on the plat. Thank you.
Any more questions for Mr. Childs? All right, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. So I'm going to open public comment here in just a sec. I do want to read a quick thing on public comment, and then we'll open it up if there's anybody here that wants to speak on it. And this goes for both sections, both items on the agenda. Public comment is limited to 3 minutes per speaker. Comments should be directed to the board and city staff and be relevant to the action item being discussed. If so desired, groups, organizations, neighborhoods, or similar associations may appoint one spokesperson to present their points of view to the board. Please note this is a comment period, so the board will not be taking or responding to questions during this step. So with that, if there's anybody in the audience that would like to make a public comment on this item, please come up and state your name and your address. Seeing none, I will now ask the applicant to come up and say a few words.
I'm John Thomas Engineering here in Newbern. Thank you for saving me from objecting to the public comment, which we're prepared to do, as you probably know.
Roger.
I think that I'll be glad to answer any questions. The staff has done a pretty good job of presenting, our application. And I'm trying to recall what George said about the parking. I guess there is concern with the parking. I didn't hear that part of it that we're showing on the map, or was there not?
If I might help, Mr. Chair.
Yes, please.
Mr. Thomas, I think Mr. Childs was talking about the parking lots where people can back out onto the street. That there's an ordinance that prohibits that back out style parking, and that's what he was bringing to the board's attention.
You said it prohibits it?
Yes, sir.
It does?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the parking lot, the on-street parking that we're showing is not going to be part of the streets? Is that what you're saying?
So it appears from the map, and this version is very small, but if one were to zoom in, it appears that the right-of-way is narrow and that the parking spaces are outside of the right-of-way. Is it your position that...
You're talking about at the units?
No, sir. In the cul-de-sac area, and there are, I think, 6 other satellite parking lots,
Yes.
the backing out onto the street is prohibited by one of the provisions of the land use ordinance.
Okay. Well, the intent was for this to be on-street parking. And the portion of the ordinance that we were reading that allowed on-street parking gave various scenarios for that to happen, either parallel parking, angle parking, all the way up to 90-degree parking. And that's the ordinance that we were going on. And there is some of that in the city as well. And you've approved them before with on-street parking. And I don't know if that's an issue or not, as far as, I guess we're talking about whether or not it's in the right of way or not.
Yes, sir. Is it your position that the parking spaces are in the right of way?
Yes, they're within the right of way. Yeah, that's what the intent was, because the portion, I don't have that with me because I didn't think it was going to be an issue tonight. But the ordinance does allow for on-street parking. Y'all approved one last week that has on-street parking. In the portion that allows on-street parking, it gives information regarding parallel parking, angle parking, either 30, 60, or 90-degree parking.
And I think in order to have on-street parking parallel or angled parking, there has to be a request to the Board of Aldermen to add them to the list of streets that would allow such parking. I think that's further into that section. But
I've not seen that type of process go through. If it's shown on the plan and it's permitted by the ordinance, then has always been allowed. I've been here since 1978, but I'm trying to understand what you're reading from. But the intent of what we did after we spoke with the Public Works folks before the last go-around when we tabled it was we felt like we needed more parking, even though the plan that we originally had that was going to be presented to you at your last meeting met the ordinance with the number of parking spaces that we were providing in front of the units. So we've added another parking space in front of the units, and we've also added about 60-some spaces in 90-degree parking off of the streets in various locations for basically overflow parking. But right now, the parking places that we have in there works out to be a little bit under 3.5 parking spaces per unit, which is pretty good for multifamily development of this type.
But we don't have a question about the number of parking spaces. We have a question about, can you back up from a parking space like this onto a city street? And if you have parking spaces that are parallel or angled on a city street, does the Board of Aldermen have to then approve that street having that parking capability? Those are the two questions we still have, right?
if you give me just 1 second,
Sure,
I'll be
no
able to
worries.
give you the language about the angled parking.
No worries.
While we wait on that, does the board have any other questions other than parking and the trash question for the applicant? Okay.
I guess the only other question that we didn't answer was, is the amenity pool
Oh, there you go.
common area future or not? While she's doing that, Mr. Thomas, we did have one other question. The
I was
amenity,
waiting if
understand.
Jamie was
That's
finished.
figure we got one more question we could ask you, which is the amenity pool area that's called out in the plan. You stated in the response back to the DRC that it was future. is that actually future? Because on the plan, it shows it as not future, as part of the development.
Which area are you talking
The
about?
amenity pool.
That is not part of the subdivision. The amenity area that's designated future is above the cul-de-sac to the left of that area. In that little text, it says future amenity area.
Well, okay, I can't see that.
Yeah, I think that what they'll do there is, like they did on the other out there, is they'll come back with a site plan review for whatever type of facility that they're going to put there, if that answers your question.
I guess I'm wondering why it was addressed by DRC if it was actually outside the area that we're considering, and why it even came up in the comments.
Good
Mr.
question.
Chair, I have that information on parking.
Yes, Jane.
So, Mr. Thomas, I'm referencing section 7214 of the Code of Ordinances for the City of New Bern. This section talks about angled parking generally. It says automobiles and vehicles shall be parked at an angle of 45 degrees with the curb of those streets or parts of streets described in another section where angled parking is allowed. Referencing your attention to section 7215, angled parking zones established, and the ordinance sets out 3 zones within the city where angled parking is permitted on street. That's Bern Street, certain sections of Bern Street, sections of George Street, and sections of Hancock Street. And that is an exhaustive list for on-street parking.
Okay.
So in this case, in the spirit of being helpful, if it's the goal to increase the number of parking spaces, given the density here, which is probably appropriate, as Mr. Thomas has indicated, one remedy may be to alternate the orientation of the parking spaces so that you don't back out onto the street. Parallel parking may resolve the issue and will certainly comply with the provisions of the land use ordinance, if that's something that the applicant has any appetite for.
What I'm hearing is parallel parking would be acceptable.
Yes, sir.
Okay. We actually looked at that for this, but with parallel parking, with the amount of linear street that we have that's not encumbered by driveways going into the units, it limits the number of spaces that we could get. Now, my client is willing to go back to the parallel parking if you don't want the 90-degree parking, okay? And it'd be in the same areas basically as where the 90-degree parking is now, but it's going to significantly reduce the number of spaces, probably less than half than what we picked up in there. Even at that, we're still going to have over 3 parking spaces per unit available for each one of those units, and we'll provide some overflow parking in case, you know, it needs to be at any particular unit for anybody visiting. And it's also will be scattered around similar to what we have there. We just converted to 90 parallel parking and adjust the right-of-way to accommodate that. Now, and further, we can if you'd like, condition approval to that, and we've not developed the actual street drawings and the water and sewer and all that. That would show up in those drawings that would go to Public Works for them to review, along with the stormwater and everything else that we do once we start putting this together.
And Mr. Chair, this board does have the authority to do a conditional approval such that the language that Mr. Thomas just articulated is included in that condition, and that any subsequent drawings are reviewed by the appropriate city staff.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like to me everybody needs to get on the same page. It's the city and you guys. There's just feels like a disconnect there to me. What is the pleasure of the board on this item?
I'll make a motion that we do not approve this plan as presented to us, and that we ask the city and the applicant to get back together to figure out this parking issue. And once it's resolved, let us know what it is, and then we'll take another vote at our next meeting or subsequent meeting.
So just to be clear with your motion, Mr. Ingram, is it your motion that the general plan approval be denied because the satellite parking is deficient?
Not because I didn't give a reason.
Okay, we have to
The-
give a reason.
Okay, so it seems to me that there was a statement that we cannot have parallel parking, or I'm sorry, angled parking like this where you're actually backing out onto a street. And there's a potential that the Board of Aldermen would have to approve parking, angled parking on this street, on these streets. So for those two reasons, I suggest we do not approve and we wait for those issues to be resolved. And if it comes back to us, we can address it at a subsequent meeting.
Is that a good motion?
I'm hearing.
It's not articulated very well.
I'm hearing the motion that the general plan be denied because of the issue with the angled parking in the plat, and that this issue could be cured by the Board of Aldermen adding these streets to the list of angled parking streets?
Well, it sounded to me like there were two issues. One is the ordinance that states if there's angled parking, you can't back out onto a street.
That's right.
Okay, so that still is being violated from, I haven't heard anybody say it's not being violated by the way this is drawn. Is that accurate?
I think that's accurate. I think the applicant also said that they're willing to modify their application to allow for parallel parking. So I don't know if that has any bearing on your motion.
Well, I mean, I'll leave it up to the other members of the board, but I would prefer to see that rather than give a conditional approval.
Can I direct a question to Mr. Thomas real quick?
Actually, we have a motion, we need a second,
Right,
and then we could do a discussion.
right.
So we have a motion on the table. Jamie's giving me confused looks as to whether or not she likes it.
It's not a matter of liking. I'm trying to make sure that the motion as it's being articulated checks all the boxes. So if we're going to deny, we have
Must
to
state the
reason.
deficiency in the basis of which the proposed subdivision could be approved. That's what I
Okay,
have
so I
here.
think Mr. Ingram's motion may satisfy those elements.
Okay,
I'll second it then.
all right. I have a motion and a second. Any discussion on this item?
I am just curious if the applicant would be comfortable with the conditional arrangement, if that's something that would help their project stay on schedule. I would just welcome knowing a little bit more information on their perspective. And if we add the condition, they still have to go through the steps that we're outlining in the condition.
Sure.
I think I heard the motion correctly. Yes, what I was going to say. It sounded to me like a denial. Is that correct?
Yeah, we haven't voted on it yet.
That's the
voted yet.
motion that's on the floor, Mr. Thomas. It has
Sorry.
not been, it's the motion on the floor. It has not been voted on yet.
Okay. Well, I was going to try to make it a little easier for y'all, if y'all want to
Okay.
listen.
Please.
We certainly want to get this right, and we've been kicking it around with staff for a year now, because this also went through special use permitting with the Board of Adjustments and all that, so it's been a while trying to get it like it's supposed to be where everybody is happy with it. And we've still got a couple of issues hanging out there. And in lieu of the motion, we would suggest maybe continue it, if that's in order, so that we could we've heard your comments, so we could make sure that we're doing it correctly by the law, and then come back at our next meeting after we have met with everybody regarding the parking. And I'm presuming that the parking is the major issue that we're talking about here, okay? Be quite honest with you, we thought we were doing the right thing, because the plan we brought in last time was an approvable plan, but in our opinion, we just didn't think it was enough parking for this particular facility there, okay? So we would be fine with another 30 days to come back to y'all with a plan that everybody's happy with.
Okay. What would you like to do with your motion? I
I
hadn't
would
heard
like
that.
I would like to amend my motion to allow the applicant to continue this item and bring it back to us at the next meeting if he so desires.
So the motion now on the floor is not for denial. The motion on the floor now is to continue the general plan application to the October Planning and Zoning Board meeting.
Yes.
Allowing the applicant time to work with city staff to work out issues that we discussed this evening.
Mr. Brunel, is that your second?
I'll second that, yes.
All right, any discussion on that item? I would just like to make one comment. I don't want to speak on behalf of the board, but I guess I kind of am. I want it to be right. So if the city wants more parking, then there's one option. If the city wants less parking, there's another option. You guys just, let's get together and let's get this done. I agree. You guys have been going back and forth for a year. It's too long. So let's get it done. And we'll come back and we'll talk about it in the next meeting. All those in favor of the motion at hand, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. All right, on to the next item. Without Limits Christian Center rezoning. This item falls under a zoning map and zoning text amendments. This board has the decision to recommend approval to finding of consistency and reasonableness, satisfying the proposed amendment is consistent with any comprehensive or applicable land use plans and determined to be reasonable and in the public interest. Or recommend denial and finding of inconsistency and unreasonableness, which is a recommendation that the Board of Aldermen deny the proposed amendment based on findings that is inconsistent with any comprehensive or application land use plans and determined to be unreasonable and not in the public interest. The existing zoning ordinance was adopted on March 5th, 1968, effective on March 15th, 1968. I just thought that was interesting. So, Kendrick, I will turn it over to you for staff comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is the second and final item for tonight. This is a rezoning starting with 002-945-2024. This is the Without Limits Christian Center, Inc. rezoning. And the request summary here, the applicant again, Without Limits Christian Center, Inc. And also may or may not be with or on behalf for James Mclver, senior pastor / president. The owner is Without Limits Christian Center, Inc. And the location is Neuse Boulevard and Kensington Park Drive. So the intersection there between both of those streets. And the current zoning is residential 8 or R-8. And the requested change as far as for the zoning is to go to commercial 3, so C-3. And the parcel identification number associated with the property is 8-216005. And the actual size, in accordance to the plat map that's recorded, is 7.50 total acres. So the residential 8 zoning district analysis, just simply give you a brief overview, but this is to accommodate for single, 2 and multifamily dwellings. It actually encourages the continued use for land uses pertaining to residential purposes, and it does discourage any use which would generate traffic on minor streets other than normal traffic to serve residences on those streets. In comparison to the commercial 3 or C3 zoning district, basically very much the opposite. These are locations that typically experience high traffic. They also engage with different uses such as offices, personal services, and retailing of convenience-like goods. And the use comparisons, or the uses comparison is here. I'll just let you briefly take a moment to look at that. But this shows the exchange and differences of what uses are allowed for the R-8 zoning district versus the comparison district of commercial 3. And following that is our first map here. This is the vicinity map for the property, and it is highlighted there in red. And that is followed by, again, our 100-foot buffer zone or area that we take for the actual property lines there. Next is the aerial imagery for the property. And that's followed again by our zoning district, zoning map, and this reflects the R-8 zoning district, and that C3 reflection is the color that's red there, the darker red. And currently, the next needed action there is the adoption of the consistency statement from the board, and also the recommendation for the Board of Aldermen. But if the board has any questions, I will take those at this time.
Board have any questions for Kendrick?
Kendrick.
Actually, I apologize. I think I have one more slide. I am so
Nope.
sorry. Nope, never mind. I apologize. Go ahead, Ms. Peoples.
Kendrick, can you just confirm for the benefit of the board and the public that this is part of the Neuse Boulevard commercial entranceway corridor?
Absolutely. It is within the actual Neuse Boulevard corridor overlay. Typically, that just engages with the commercial district uses, or so essentially C3 type and style of uses. So any uses that are appropriate for a C3, pending, let's say this rezoning were to be approved officially, those C3 uses then would be able to be placed in that corridor. So.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kendra. We'll open it up to public comment. Does anybody have any comments on this item that they would like to share with us? All right. Seeing none, we will go to any applicant comments if the applicant is here. Sure. If you have anything to say, you're not required to, but if you would like to, go ahead. If you don't, it's entirely up to you.
Well, I'll just say thank you for having us on the agenda this evening, and we're just really in the planning, praying stages just for the next phase of our ministry, and that is, we really own that whole block, so what we're on is already C3, and the goal prayerfully is to have a big multi-purpose where we can do just more continued community events and some church events, and just take that land and just use it for some better things than it just sitting there at this time. So just thank you for your consideration.
All right. Thank you, sir. What is pleasure of the board on this item?
Brad, I have one quick question for the applicant.
Sure. Go right ahead.
Just curious if the tax exemption status would be impacted at all with the rezoning?
You mean as far as the ministry paying taxes on the property?
Yeah, as it is currently underneath the residential zoning, would there be any impacts with this change to a commercial zoning?
So no, I believe everything would stay as is. However, I don't believe we pay taxes on that at this time.
Okay.
Yeah, so we don't pay any taxes on that. When we first purchased the property, they had us fill out a bunch of information. We had to go and do a few different things. So it won't have any impact.
Okay. Thank you.
Pleasure of the board.
I make a motion that we recommend approval and finding of consistency and reasonableness to the Board of Aldermen.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those opposed, or all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. So with that, thank you, sir. Good luck with the Board of Aldermen. I think they'll do you well. New business. Is there any new business to the board?
I had a couple of questions.
Sure.
Well, I guess a couple of items. The first is the rules and procedures that we approved at the last meeting.
Yes.
Can we get a final, because I think they were still in flux, can we get a final copy of those for the board members?
So Kendrick and I looked at them this evening and I signed them. I will send that to you.
Okay, great.
I'll send them to everybody this
Thank you
evening.
very much. Okay. The other item I wanted to talk about was something that we've been talking about for a long time, which is parking in the city of New Bern, which is always an issue and always a subject of discussion and some consternation in some circles. Now that we have our rules and procedures, one of the things we've talked about now for a few months is having a parking committee that would start looking at the parking, not suggesting that there is an issue, not suggesting that everything is okay, but just suggesting as part of the planning and zoning board, we would take it on to look at parking in the city of New Bern to assess what is needed, is there an issue, what kinds of recommendations could be made to the Board of Aldermen. and understanding that the Board of Aldermen are not asking us to do this, but if we did it, we would be taking it on as a board and making recommendations to them. So what I would like to see is a parking committee made up of members of this board, limited to 4 or less, so it's not a quorum, so we can have meetings, et cetera. Board member Deering and Brad and myself have met a couple of times to talk about this. And so maybe the 3 of us could do that, and if another member of the board wanted to be part of that parking committee, we could certainly just let us know, and that would happen. So I'd like to make a motion that we establish a parking committee as part of the Planning and Zoning Board, and that we would act independently and bring back any information and assessments we get back to the board for potential passing to the Board of Aldermen.
Working group.
Working group, excuse me. Not
I was just getting ready to say that. I was going to say, could you please change it to working group?
Let me change my motion to establishing a parking working group amongst the board, the members of the Planning and Zoning Board.
Rusty, quick point of discussion on that. Do we know how that would either parallel the Renew Bern effort or intersect the Renew Bern effort? And maybe that's a question for Robert too.
Well, my anticipation of that is the two things are somewhat independent. At least what we've talked about as a group up to this point is the first part of this is assessing. Is there an issue? What kinds of things are happening with the parking areas in the city of New Bern, and not just downtown, but in other areas potentially as well. And my expectation is that whatever we find, whatever we think, would have to be in accordance with the land use plan or the land use ordinance. So I would think those two things are separate, but obviously the parking committee's recommendations would have to rely on whatever gets approved.
Mm-hmm. And Robert, I guess just a question: is there anything being looked at or researched as part of the ongoing Renew Bern effort with parking?
Parking standards are being looked at. Every section of the ordinance is being reevaluated. And to speak on whether or not this would have any effect on that ordinance, findings in the work group itself, whatever they find or recommend, may not have an effect on the new ordinance. However, if the alderman directed changes prior to that ordinance being adopted, we would then have to revisit everything. So the recommendation itself wouldn't, but if there were physical changes to the existing ordinance, we would have to reevaluate whatever was changed for the new ordinance.
My anticipation of this working group is that we're not going to be proposing new standards for parking and things that I would anticipate would be in a land use ordinance document, more along the lines of, do we need more parking? Do we need a parking structure? Are we good with the parking we have? Do we need to change any other ordinances around times for parking, things like that? It's just to kind of look at the parking situation and say, do we really have any issues anymore? Or are we good with where we are? I don't know. I think it's, from my perspective, I don't know if you have any comments on this, but it's more of a planning, looking at it more from a planning for the city perspective. But it's a good question.
And I'm just thinking about how it's a pretty unique opportunity to be in the process of the whole Renew Bern effort. And so perhaps there's some milestones or schedule considerations that could align, that if the working group has inputs or discussion topics, that it could be incorporated while that whole process is opened up. And I just want to make sure it's not duplicative of anything that the overall process is already doing or looking at.
I think if this were to be established, when that draft land use ordinance comes out, there could be some things in there that we may find relatively quickly enough to get them maybe incorporated. As Robert says, it doesn't have to be. Maybe we make some, maybe the working group makes some suggestions to the consultant. Maybe the consultant thinks they're good, and he puts them in, and then maybe that thing gets passed. I think that would be a good thing, and then maybe not. I agree with Rusty. There is a sentiment to the citizens that there is a parking problem. There is much less clarity as to whether or not we do. And I think I think that a working group with the talent that we have on this board could go find that out and perhaps give the citizens a good answer as to whether or not we do. And then if we do, then, maybe then it's on to the Board of Aldermen to come up with some solutions or not. That would be their prerogative. But I think somebody somewhere needs to come up with some data to help the citizens understand if there is, because I know there's a lot of back and forth on both sides of the issue. And that's what I have on it. So we have a motion on the table. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any more discussion on this item? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Okay, motion carries.
And Mr. Chair, I'm going to insert my sound bite that I say every time this comes up. Generally, it is prudent to seek the advice or direction from the governing board before undertaking these actions. And I understand in Mr. Ingram's recitation why he's making the motion at this juncture under these circumstances, but I just wanted to have that helpful note in your hearing so that you might reflect upon that and use that information to the extent that you find it useful.
Thank you, Jamie. Is there any other new business to be discussed? All right, hearing none. Staff comments. Any staff comments?
So just to add briefly, just so kind of make the board aware. So for the next meeting, we're probably going to have at least a minimum for, you have the item that was continued tonight in addition to the Bern crossing. Both of those should be on for the next meeting. If something changes, of course, the agenda, as it gets sent out a week in advance, you'll see that on the agenda. But just trying to make you guys aware just so you have more time to understand what's coming.
Okay,
So
awesome.
That's the only comment for me.
All right, thank you, Kendrick. No other staff comments. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Second.
A motion and second. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? We are adjourned.